ready to go, and we have liftoff, and we're only a couple minutes behind schedule, but it was really important that we make sure everybody had the opportunity to come and to sit down. I'm really, really grateful to you guys for being here this evening. My name is Chrissy Houlihan. I serve us down in Washington, D.C., and I'll get into some of the details. Welcome to what I think is our 68th town hall? 68. So tonight, we will talk a little bit about a welcome and an agenda. I also thought that it was important to give you a bit of a legislative update, sort of what is going on in Washington. I'll be returning down to Washington tomorrow. We will have a panel discussion today. Our format for today to talk about safety and school safety will be to bring a bunch of experts from our community up on stage after I have this quick overview. Our question and answers will be moderated by Mary Curley, who's the CCIU Communications Director here. And so she will be collecting your questions and asking them of our panel. And then, of course, a little bit for closing remarks, and then we will be concluding this evening. So we will try really hard to be respectful of all of our time. Speaking of trying really hard to be respectful of all of our time, as I mentioned earlier, part of my time and my background is having been a high school chemistry teacher. And one of the things I learned about that specifically was, number one, hardest job ever that I ever did, including this one right here, right now. And number two, that it's really important to set norms, how we will behave with one another when we are in a setting like this, so that we can have the opportunity to get the most out of these kinds of important conversations. And so what is a norm? It's the way that we behave when we're together. One is, I hope that we can treat each other with respect, and that we don't talk with titles at the door. I hope when you meet me and you meet my team, you will hear us introduce ourselves by our first name. I think that's really important. We will, as I mentioned, use our time really wisely, and we'll stick to the agenda. If for some reason you guys have a question that is not necessarily directly on the path of what it is that we're talking about today, that's okay. My team and I will be in contact with you to talk about those issues as well. If you have the opportunity to ask a question, we ask that it be something that's called a clarifying question, and that just basically means, I think what I heard is, can you reframe the question? Can you restate what it was that you were saying? Not something that's accusatory or that's pointing at someone. And lastly, we will talk here about policies and not politics. We will be talking about solutions. Here's what I would ask of you guys in participating. We are a large group. We think that we're about more than 100 people. Each of you, I hope, has gotten a question card. If you haven't, give your raise of your hand. The question card has a front and a back. If you have a question, please fill out the front and the back. And we ask you please also to make sure that it's filled out legibly, so that when we have the opportunity to reach out to you on the back side of this conversation, that we can make sure that we have a good contact that we can read. I think it's important, before we begin our conversation about school safety, to talk a little bit about congressional update. As I mentioned, I'll be back in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. I leave tomorrow morning to go down for the week. Quickly, before we get into that though, who are we? Who do I represent? I represent us down in Washington for the 6th Congressional District. There are 18 congressional districts in Pennsylvania. In another several weeks, there will be only 17 because we will have lost a district in the last redistricting and shuffle. I represent the 6th, and the 6th right now is all of Chester County and the lower portion of Berks County. And the 6th in the future will also be all of Chester County with a little bit more of Berks County, inclusive of the city of Reading. So just a little bit of a bump out in terms of how many people each person represents. This is some of the things that we will be wrapping up when I go down to Washington. Reminder of some of the important legislation that passed in the last couple of years. We were able to pass the American Rescue Plan, which brought a lot of resources to our schools, in particular relative to this conversation. It brought help to be able to make our schools safer, not only for our own health, but for our mental health, among other things. We passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. I was able to meet with a steel manufacturing company today, and we spoke about this particular piece of legislation, which brings historic infrastructure funding to our nation for the first time in more than 30 years. We were able to pass a lot of support for Ukraine. You might hear about that as well in the next couple of weeks. Some more support might go through the PACT Act for those of us who are veterans in the audience and those of us who've loved a veteran or have served with one. The PACT Act helps our modern day veterans be able to access health care who may have been exposed to toxins. The Inflation Reduction Act is a piece of legislation that we were able to pass again in this last couple of years that focuses on health care costs, reducing reducing prescription drug costs and allowing for more people to have access to health care. And it also focuses on renewable energies and greening our economy and making sure that we can be energy independent. And lastly, what we're here to talk about, which is the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is one of the pieces of legislation that speaks about making sure that we are safer in our communities. Before December 31st, and this I believe is my last slide before we move forward, these are the kinds of things you will likely hear in the headlines. We absolutely must fund the government before December 16th. If we don't do that, we will be in a position where we have been before, where we will need to pass something that's called a continuing resolution, which allows us to continue to fight about how we're going to fund the government, or we may end up in a place where we will shut the government down, which is actually how I was sworn into Congress 4 years ago when we had the longest shutdown in history, as you might recall. Hopefully none of that will happen, and rather you will hear that we will have funded the government. We will likely be able to raise the debt ceiling. It's sounding like Congress, both the House and the Senate, are interested in doing that. We will likely pass the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the annual funding of our Defense Department. It has happened every year, year in and year out for the last 60 or so years. So this is a reliable piece of legislation that I hope we will also pass. Finally, we might pass the child tax credit. This was a piece of legislation that was in the American Rescue Plan, but that expired. And there's a lot of interest in passing it permanently. We will see if there's an appetite for that, both in the House and the Senate. We will also possibly make DACA residence permanent. This is again something that will take 60 votes in the Senate to be able to happen. This is not something that the House has any say in any longer. We have already passed that legislation, so you'll have to pay attention to what happens in the Senate for that. And lastly, Congress, I hope, will pass the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. I've just spent the entire day in our community at steel mills, at a mushroom farm, at the Hearst potato chip factory. Every last one of the groups that I sat with is desperate for labor. This is an opportunity in the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that's been passed by the House to hopefully also get a ride on the Senate side when the government is funded, so the very top bullet point. So if you're watching your news streams in the next couple of weeks, that's what you should probably see. Now for tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about mental health, school safety, and gun violence prevention. I bring to you this conversation honestly. As I mentioned, I come to you as a former school teacher, as a mom, and as a veteran. I very much believe and support in the Second Amendment. I really very much believe, as I think many of us do in our community, most of us do, in responsible gun ownership. We anticipate or we expect that about 40% of us in our community are gun owners, including my mother in that. I also believe that there really is further congressional action that can be taken to reduce gun violence and to make sure that we're taking meaningful action to prevent future generations. This is the #1 cause of death amongst our children, is gun violence right now. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which I mentioned earlier, has been signed into law. That means that 60 members of the House, the Senate at least, and the majority of the House and the President had to sign this piece of legislation. So as you know, we are a relatively divided Congress, and that means that this was a piece of legislation that many, many of us were able to agree on and pass into law. The things that were in this were enhanced background checks for people who are under 21 years old, meaning that if you are between 18 and 21, you have to go through a different process than if you're older than 21. It also closes the boyfriend loophole, which allows people to be, it makes sure that people who may be threatening to significant relationships in their life to not have the opportunity to harm people who are in their sphere. It also imposes penalties for straw purchases and increases mental health services. This was one of the biggest things that we were able to agree on, was that we wanted to make sure that we were understanding what was causing gun violence and making sure that we were safer, and we wanted to make sure we were looking at mental health issues in particular on this. And lastly, support for schools, making sure that schools can be safer. This means making sure that the facilities are safer, making sure that the teachers are trained differently or with instruction that's helpful, making sure that that the students have the opportunities to be in safer environments. And so this was, as I mentioned, kind of a hodgepodge of bipartisan agreements on this is what a package looks like that will keep our children more safe in our communities. There is tons of work still to be done in Washington, D.C., and these are just a few of the other pieces of legislation that will possibly have the opportunity to be passed. I mention these just because I think that they're relevant and a lot of people have called our office about them. Ethan's Law, which increases firearm storage requirements for homes that have children in them. The Bipartisan Background Check Act and Enhanced Background Checks Act still also have the opportunity to pass. And there are more than 10 other pieces of legislation that I'd be happy to share with you when we have more time. In addition, when I'm in our community, I have the opportunity to have events like this to make sure that we're having these conversations, whether we're in small groups and we're talking about mental health, or whether we're in large groups and we're talking about a town hall about problem solving, these kinds of issues, or the opportunity to meet with the DA's office or the FBI. These are all things that we are doing actively when we're home in our community and when we're in Washington, D.C. as well. So today we are going to be, I am 1 minute behind my 2-minute ahead schedule. We're going to have the opportunity to have a panel. For those who are new to town halls, what we try to do is we try to have a conversation about a specific issue. I don't think it's terribly constructive to have sort of like a sparring match about all the things. I think it's more helpful to be able to bring people together over 1 or 2 issues at a time and make sure that we're scene setting for that and providing expert people who are able to help us with this. So to that end, we have Dr. George Fiore here. He's our Executive Director from the Chester County Intermediate Unit. We have Deb Ryan here. Where did Deb go? Over there. Our district attorney. I had the opportunity of visiting her awesome office. We have Senator Carolyn Committee here as well to join us from the representing us in Harrisburg. And last week we had Dan Williams, our representative in the Coatesville area in general. Where's Pastor Williams? Over there. And so these will be our panelists. I would invite them to the stage. The format of this, after we raise the screen, will be I'll ask each one of them a question, which is usually some of the questions we get most frequently. And then you guys will be filling in your cards, handing them in, and Mary will be organizing them into sort of piles so that we don't have 5 of the same questions and 12 of the same questions. So with that, I will hopefully raise this thingy, a magic, and we will join the stage. You guys all put yourself in the right order. It's pretty fancy. All right, well, thank you, first of all, everybody, for joining us here again, and thank you to the amazing panel that we've been able to put together from our community. This issue of school safety, children's safety, our safety is a vast one, and it requires all of us from all different levels of government to be involved and engaged in all of our community as well. And so, without further ado, I would like to start with Dr. Fiore. I know many maybe don't know that you work with a lot of the districts in Chester County, all sizes, whether they're rural or dense, whether they're kindergarten or 12th grade. I would ask of you if you could kind of explain to us, what are you hearing most from our parents or children or educators?
Thank you, Chrissy, and I really appreciate you holding this town hall, because I look at it from a few different vantage points. Not only am I the executive director here at the Chester County Intermediate Unit, but I'm also a constituent. I have 3 children, 1 in high school, 1 in middle school, and 1 in elementary school. So it's a really important issue, because it's not what many of us went to school worrying about, or what we sent our kids to school worrying about. I watch my 15-year-old, 13-year-old, and 8-year-old have fear about their safety. That's something that I never experienced as a student, and many of us probably didn't either. So, as Christy said earlier, it is the #1 cause of death now of children in America. This is a startling change for how schools operate, and what we're hearing from our school leaders, and it's not only in Chester County, but it's across the entire Commonwealth. School safety is the #1 issue on every one of our school leaders' mind. It's one that it's not only about gun violence, it's also about mental health issues. It's about bullying. So it's a very broad issue that we're trying to approach to make sure our kids are safe every day. And you look at post-pandemic, with some of the post-COVID situations, we're seeing increases in behaviors from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So this is an expansive issue that we're trying to approach. The other challenge when we consider school safety is schools were not set up to be fortresses. And when you think about every building, they're actually set up with a lot of doors to get a lot of people in and out quickly. I was a high school principal with 2,000 students, and the largest activity we had was a fire drill. Remember, those were the drills we'd go through, were fire drill, trying to get as many kids out. We had a timer as fast as we could get them out quietly and then get them back in the building. Well, now we're looking at all of those doors and trying to make sure that they are safe, secure, and we're trying to keep people out. Very different setup. So what that entails then for our school district leaders is, and our school boards and our staff, is you need a lot of resources. I mean, think about if anybody's been in an airport and trying to get on a plane, think about TSA. The amount of people for one person to walk through a metal detector. There's plenty of people working. Imagine that in a school with 2,000 children trying to get them in and out. Then you put that's a lot of manpower, but also a lot of money. So a lot of our districts are stretched in how do we afford all these things, because we want to do them today. We want to do all of it today, and we know that's not realistic. So our biggest issue is trying to secure enough funding to be able to make sure we have the appropriate physical security. But on the other side of it, we have the mental health supports, and that's a staffing issue. We also need to identify students that are in need of assistance. So you look at these two issues, the good news in Chester County is all 12 of our school districts, our 4 charter schools, and our non-public schools are working very well together. It is one item I would say, and that's, I have Senator Comita, Representative Williams, the Chester County delegation of legislators came together, led by Representative Sappy, to approach mental health. And we have a county-wide approach to not only address mental health. We've been working sadly with the closure of Brandywine Hospital. That we lost a big resource, but we've been working together to get more resources. You have Christiana Care in the southern part of the county that's open. So we're working together to try to solve these problems, because there's not enough people, there's never enough money. But the one thing we do have is a coalition of the willing. We have school districts that are willing to work together, we have legislators who are behind us, and on the item of school safety, District Attorney Ryan, I'm sure she's going to talk about it, but we've started a Chester County task force on school safety and security. First time we've had one in Chester County. So as they say, children can't learn if they don't feel safe. And we're trying to make sure we do everything, because there's a lot at stake. And as a dad of 3 children, I want them to feel every day that they're safe in school, so they can learn, so they can eventually leave my house and get a job.
Thank you so much. Same. And really, some of the way you're talking about is resources and making sure that you have the ability to make our schools safer are some of the funds that we hope will be heading your way. My next question is for Deb. Could you speak a little bit, I know George sort of alluded to it, to what efforts you guys are making in your office to address school safety in our county?
Sure, thank you so much, Chrissy. So what George had said is true. I think we're both a little grayer over the past few years working together, because what keeps us up at night is the safety of our schools. It's not unusual for me to get a phone call at 5 in the morning about a new threat to another school in our county, to try to figure out what to do, to see who do we enlist to assist with this investigation, if it's credible or not credible. So these are the things that we are working towards on a daily basis, and it's extremely alarming for the parents, for the students, for the people in our schools. They are dealing with this almost on a daily basis, or it had been in at least one area of our county in an unprecedented way, where we were getting a barrage of threats through an online anonymous tip site called Safe to Say. So you may have read about it, you may be familiar with it, you may be impacted by it, but it wasn't unusual for us to be getting multiple threats on a given day and have to make that call. Do we close the school? Do we evacuate the school? Do we engage in a lockdown? And these are really, really scary things for children to have to go through, and parents, myself included, are also concerned. Are our kids safe? Are our educators safe? Are we doing the right thing? So what I'll tell you is that we have a lot of really outstanding collaboration throughout the county. George and I speak very frequently with the task force that we started. We have been meeting with all of the superintendents, first responders, my office, and the chief law enforcement officers of the respective jurisdictions to ensure that we are up to date with all of our preparation and planning. We do not want to have another Parkland, Sandy Hook, Uvalde. These are the things that really do keep us up at night to make sure that we are following all the best practices. We are involved with experts in this area, and like George said, they're educators there. They didn't get into this business thinking they were going to have to protect children's lives or their staff's lives. So by bringing in law enforcement, we're making sure that we have everybody trained. We're training students, we're training educators, staff, and we are bringing in law enforcement to do that as well. So we're reviewing all of our safety protocols and school assessments to ensure that everybody is on the same page with respect to an active threat situation, whether it's a shooter or otherwise. We do not want to be unprepared. We hope that we're overly prepared and nothing happens. But we're also being pragmatic about this, which is that we have to work together to ensure we know who the first call is, who the second call is, where our parents go, where the kids go, whether the kids are trained and teachers are trained. I went to school, an elementary school in Phoenixville recently to watch an active shooter drill, and there were little 6 and 7-year-old kids who were extremely compliant with what was being requested of them, and they seemed to handle it really well. It's a very unfortunate turn of events that this is what we have to do, but we have to be prepared. So with what George said too about getting mental health in the schools, it's paramount to ensure that we're protecting kids who may go through this type of trauma and the educators who go through this type of trauma. But we're all working together to make sure that we are doing everything we can to be on top of this. So we are working quarterly at least, but initially George and I are on the phone a lot, just trying to make sure we have the right stakeholders in the room. We do have that, and we have the support of our elected officials. So I'm very grateful to the people who are on this dais right now, along with others around the county who do want to make sure that our schools are safe. And they've offered to, give us some money, which is what we're looking to get, because we need money to get these things done, making sure we have good communications with our first responders and the educators and staff members in the school, making sure we have video surveillance cameras. I mean, as draconian as that might seem to some of you as parents, we need to do that to ensure the safety of the kids, make sure that we can see what's going on, and that in the event that there is a catastrophe of some kind, we're prepared, we know where to go, we know how to handle it. So some of the other things that we have taken upon ourselves is to engage in prevention and education training in the schools, particularly with respect to internet safety and child abuse, which are some of the most prevalent things that we are actually seeing in the schools today. We're seeing an increase in things like extortion, where kids are sending naked images of themselves and then they're being asked to give money in exchange for that image not being disseminated. That's a real occurrence that's going on throughout all the schools right now. And child abuse is rife. Like I have said before, I'll say it 1,000,000 times, this is one of the biggest epidemics we're facing right now. We had an 800% increase in child abuse cases over the past 5 years in Chester County. This is not unique to Chester County by any stretch, but this is something that we need to ensure we're doing the proper prevention and education programming to protect our children. So we're constantly in touch with the superintendents and our local officials to ensure that the right thing is being done to the best of our abilities. And I think we're making some good strides.
Thank you, Deb. And speaking of money and resources and what we can do to help on all the issues that you both have brought up, whether mental health, whether school safety of the facilities, whether training. Carolyn, Senator, you serve on a variety of really cool and important committees: education, health and human services, emergency preparedness, all of them germane and relevant for what this conversation is. Can you help us understand how you all in Harrisburg are assisting our communities, whether by finding the federal monies that we've been sending or our state monies as well, and potentially some examples as well? Also, we're going to try and end our this part of the conversation at 5 after, so we have enough time for questions.
Thanks, Chrissy. Good evening, friends. Thanks to each of you for being here tonight. So you may know that we have a new administration in Harrisburg. Starting in January, we have Governor-elect Josh Shapiro, Lieutenant Governor-elect Austin Davis, And Shapiro served, as you know, as our Attorney General for the past 5 years. He has worked to take on gun violence and the addiction crisis. He's also been working to address mental health, educational and economic opportunity, and the underlying causes of violence in our communities. The new leadership in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, where the Democrats have narrowly won a majority, is a factor, and we believe that both of those factors are going to change the dynamics in Harrisburg and may actually impact how we will utilize the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This act represents a significant opportunity to better protect our kids, keep our schools safe, our children safe, and reduce the threat of violence in local communities. It invests billions of dollars nationwide in mental health, school safety, and state-led crisis intervention programs. We don't yet have the exact allocations that the Commonwealth will receive, but some of the programs we know will include the following: a $1 billion investment in mental health for community behavioral health centers and telehealth services, suicide prevention programs, school-based trauma and mental health support, and provider training. There will be $2 billion in funding for schools for the following: more school-based mental health services, more mental health staff and counselors, enhanced safety measures, and violence prevention efforts. $750 million will be there for us to implement crisis intervention court proceedings programs that help keep deadly weapons out of the hands of anyone who poses a danger to themselves or to others. Pennsylvania is already working in some of these areas, and I do hope and I expect that we can use these federal funds to build on those efforts. For example, Chester County has a drug court and a veterans court. This summer, we implemented the 988 hotline for those who are suicidal, in emotional distress, or facing a mental health or substance abuse crisis. This year, Pennsylvania is providing about $200 million for school mental health and safety and security program grants. And about half of that money will go to behavioral health programming, and half will support physical security upgrades. School districts in Chester County will see $4.6 million in total funding. The increased investments in mental health and wellness were included in this year's budget process. Student behavioral health and wellness are a key part of school safety. Pennsylvania already provides grants for school and community safety through Pennsylvania Department of Education's Office for Safe Schools and the Pennsylvania Nonprofit Security Grant Program. So those are all areas that we can build on. What we can do better is to support and co-sponsor legislation, Senate Bill 134, to establish extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of those who present a risk to themselves or others. I also introduced legislation, Senate Bill 791, to increase access to counselors, psychologists, social workers, and nurses in our schools. We need to support legislation to incentivize more young people to become certified school counselors, social workers, psychologists, or nurses by providing stipends during their internships. So we continue to take steps to help ensure trauma-informed approach to education in Pennsylvania classrooms. Pennsylvania School Code requires that schools include information on a trauma-informed approach in educator professional development. So I hope this helps to outline the direction that Pennsylvania is going in regarding school and community safety.
Thanks.
We have a great resource in Westchester's Center of Contemplative Studies, which offers free resources on mindfulness meditation, and a new program is coming there. So stay tuned on that. Again, thank you, Chrissy, and everyone for being here. And Chrissy, thank you so much for supporting and voting for this bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
You're welcome, Senator. I appreciate it. Thank you, Carolyn. And last but certainly not least, Representative Dan Williams. It's hard to have a conversation and not about this issue right now and not bring up Coatesville, which is near and dear to our hearts. And such an amazing community with enormous promise and so many amazing kids and educators and parents. How, Representative Williams, can we better connect with our families, particularly in the Coatesville community, to enlist their help and support so that we can begin to prevent some of the things that are ongoing and concerning behavior in places like Coatesville?
So good evening, everyone, and Chrissy, thank you for the opportunity just to talk about a subject that I think is important on so many levels. I think it should also, I'll risk redundancy by saying this is not just a problem within the Coatesville area. This is happening in places like Unionville, Radnor, and all across our country. So in many ways, we are looking at a conflated series of events that have, number one, perpetrated violence on a generation that's now responding violently to some of that. And so in many ways, we have to be thinking like we are on this panel. And by that I mean in collaborative efforts. You have right now a combination of state and federal and local representatives who are working together to try to solve what really is a national problem. And one of the things that's taking place right now in the district is that there's a collaboration with the DA, the Chester County Emergency Management Services, along with law enforcement, the FBI, and the Director of Safe to Save. So each of these agencies working together, I think, bring us to the potential of resolve, if not completely, at least making inroads into a problem that is national. When it comes to parents and making those kinds of connections, I think parents have to be at the table in these kinds of discussions. I am a father of three, and I think Dr. Fiore is right. At least in my days, we were having drills based upon air raids. That was a different kind of security threat. Right now, we're looking at a sort of recycling of an old narrative where it's unsafe in some ways to go to school. And so I think when you're bringing parents together and working at new and possibly creative and imaginative ways to reach them, for instance, transforming teachers' parent night into a kind of family night, providing training and workshops for parents, both in video, online, as well as on-site. These are ways we continue to build those connections and create at least an ethos between the educators and parents that is wholesome and helpful towards addressing some of the issues we've been talking about tonight. I'm happy to say, Senator Committer, that I was a yes vote in what was a historic budget that provided more resources to education than we've seen in decades. And so my hope is that these kinds of collaborative efforts bring us to a point of resolve and at least helping to create the kind of environment, it's not just in Coatesville, but across the Commonwealth, where going back to school, feeling safe in connection with the entities I've described, the district attorney, law enforcement, the FBI, and parents, turns out to work out in our best interest in the ways we have not yet experienced. I'm hopeful that we will get there, and I might also say that I appreciate these kinds of discussions, Chrissy, that allow us to get what I think are appropriate solutions based upon light rather than heat, information rather than emotion. I'm happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Williams. Always such an inspiration and eloquence. Right now, we're moving over to Mary Curley, who's the Director of Communications here, and she's going to be, looks like she's got a pile of questions, but they're sorted in some sort of order, and she'll be dishing questions to us with what remains of our time.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, everyone. So one of the questions, the first question, that I have, and Dr. Fiore and District Attorney Ryan both kind of touched upon this. And that is to deal with mental health and the crisis, the rising suicide rates that we have, and then a lot of it sometimes seems to be connected to a device that we all know and love, and that is our cell phone. From social media, District Attorney Ryan, you talked about students taking photos of themselves. So many schools have started to take steps in curbing cell phone use in schools. And this person would like to know, what more can we do and how can parents help in joining the fight in working with our students for mental health?
Sure. So it's a complex issue. So anybody who has teenagers understands how difficult it is in trying to pry those devices away from their hands. What I would recommend for, and Representative Williams hit upon it, the partnership with parents is critical. There's nothing more important than parents being with their children and setting expectations on use of those devices. You can put on applications that can restrict usage, timing. I'm surprised I didn't get a text while here because in the next hour, my kids, they're not allowed to use their devices at 7 o'clock. But there are things that you can do to mitigate that. That will help. During the school day, there's a variety of different approaches that are used across the county and across the entire region on how to mitigate social media use. But it's something that they're going to have to live with. Here's the caveat. As they get older, they're going to have to learn how to manage it because it's not going anywhere, right? So we want to teach them responsible use, appropriate use, and in fact, how to leverage it to make yourself better, get information, and be more efficient with your time. That's the challenge that we have with these kinds of devices, including social media. So there's a balance, but it is critical that parents help because we get students for 7.5 hours in the day. We need help on the remaining part of that day and making sure kids are safe and they're able to manage that device, which is very powerful. And District Attorney Ryan alluded to the sextortion issues that are happening. That's a real issue that kids are dealing with. And then you couple that with possible bullying. That's a lot for a child to handle. It's a lot for an adult to handle. So that partnership is welcome, and I would definitely reach out to your school districts if you need assistance.
And if I could just add a few more things, we have prevention and education programs for all of our students. Some of that is conducted by my detectives that go and talk about internet safety, cybersecurity, child abuse. But what's most critical is for you as parents or grandparents or guardians is to have these conversations with your children because they're uncomfortable. The kids need to hear directly from you. They need to understand that there should be some safeguards in place. You pay the phone bill, I imagine, for most of these phones. It's your house, your rules. You should be going through their phone. As invasive as you may think that is, what we're seeing, like George just talked about again, are these sextortion cases. These are real cases that are happening in every single school throughout the county. I can't reinforce that enough. Nobody's immune to it. These kids are terrified, and they are actually at times ending up committing suicide because they don't think they have an out. They think that they are stuck because someone has an image of them, a naked image that they're going to disseminate. The threat of that image going into the internet and into the world indefinitely, indelibly, is enough for these kids to actually take their own lives. And so we're seeing this escalate. And so I can't stress enough how important it is to have these dialogues with your children. They're young, they're impressionable, they don't realize there's a way out of these situations, but you have to have the conversation and know you love them no matter what. You want to make sure they're safe, and these are why these rules are so important. We rely on you to message that to your kids.
Thank you. So another area that we were talking about, and this goes to funding. So for example, at the IU alone, we have 1 million square feet of real estate in Chester County where we have programs. So it's from the northern to the central to the southernmost part of the county. So are there going to be future efforts and funding to expand regional law enforcement?
I
I'd be happy to try from a federal perspective on that question. There was a piece of legislation that we recently passed in the House bipartisanly that speaks to what our challenges are here in our community. We have largely very small police forces in Chester and Berks County, which is different than places like Philadelphia or other large cities. And our police forces are struggling to compete for resources, for manpower, for all of the kinds of things with the larger cities that maybe are perhaps more proximate and better resourced. And so we passed a piece of legislation in the House that I would encourage you guys to call your senators about, which speaks exactly to this, making sure that we're bringing federal resources, federal training support to our smaller police forces in places like Chester and Berks County. So you have 3 weeks still. I hate to sound like a broken record in this Congress to call and ask people to be supportive of the legislation that would bring resources to our law enforcement. And then what happens is, you remember your Schoolhouse Rock, is it starts all over again. Every bill gets reintroduced and it starts over again. So hopefully we'll be able to continue to press for increased support for our law enforcement.
Thank you. Then staying on that theme of police presence in schools, one of our audience members asks, does police in schools increase safety, or does this place more students on the school to prison pipeline?
If you don't mind, I'll start. Recently we had a law enforcement student symposium that we held at the Chester County Courthouse. We brought in 50 students from all different schools together with law enforcement, and we asked this exact question. We wanted to know, how do you feel about law enforcement, the presence of uniformed police officers in your schools? Is that something that is comforting? Is it something that causes some type of anxiety? Because I had spoken to parents before who had indicated to me and others that this was an often anxiety-inducing experience for students to see people with guns walking around the schools. I asked this to 50 students. All 50, almost all 50, I believe, indicated that they felt a sense of comfort having law enforcement, uniformed law enforcement officers in their schools. The students that now have SROs, school resource officers, and not every school has one in Chester County, but the ones that do, told me they have outstanding relationships with these men and women. These are people who are committed to helping our youth. These are the men and women to whom children are often disclosing issues that they have at home or that they're seeing at their school. These are the men and women they feel comfortable sharing things with. So I know that that has been out there, that there is potentially a chilling effect if you have these people out there, but when I talked to the students, they didn't feel that way.
Congresswoman Houlihan, you touched upon some of this, the gun legislation that has passed and is pending. So 2 specific pieces that have been asked for. Is there any, what is your forecast for Ethan's bill, and is there any chance that the Brady bill could be re-upped?
What I would say is, of course, there's always a chance for all of these bills. And as I mentioned, we have a kind of closing aperture right now with many of them. But every couple of years, we get a do-over, literally, where we start over again, and where you guys have the opportunity with any piece of legislation, regardless of topic, to advocate. Every single 2 years, and I've only been in Congress for 4 now, there's about 9,000 pieces of legislation that get introduced. We end up only passing a few hundred of them out of the House, and a couple hundred of them actually make it to law. So when you're paying attention to specific pieces of legislation, older ones like Brady, newer ones like Ethan's Law, it's a momentum issue, right? We need you guys to be advocating. We need you guys to be calling our offices and asking us to be supportive of the things that matter to you. And we also ask you guys to recognize that there might be several pieces of legislation that might accomplish something similar. And so what we're looking for in our office, and this is independent of whether this is about school safety or guns or any other issue, is we're looking for bipartisan support. in my office. We want to make sure that this has a chance to happen, because if it's partisan, likely it won't. We're also looking for people who are leading the initiative who have a chance to bring it through committee and onto the House floor for a vote. We want to make sure it is viable. And so we might ask you, if you're interested in this particular issue, whether you've considered another piece of legislation, or whether we could consider, putting our name on something else. And so that's kind of the thought process of how we manage each one of these. So I also will tell you, in my 4 years of experience, which is not terribly long, it's stunning how quickly something can happen that didn't seem possible before. And so this is one of those things where you gotta strike at the right time, and all of a sudden everything happens, and magic happens. So don't despair on these issues.
Thank you. Senator Committa and Representative Williams, you spoke about the money that is coming in through both the federal government and the legislature this year. Can you talk more on how the funds are dispersed? You talked about the $100 million for physical upgrades at schools and $4.6 million for each district. Is there a list for each school district? Can you explain more how the money is distributed?
Certainly. As I mentioned, the money that will be coming directly to Chester County and Chester County schools through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has not been fully allocated and designated yet, so that's still coming. The money that went through the budget process and the monies that are coming through this Safer Communities Act will be then distributed through a number of avenues. And the school district has a list of all, and of course, my office and all of the senators let our school districts know, and the representatives let our school districts know, here are these new grant monies that are available for this specific school safety program. Here's the deadline, here's how you apply. And some of the monies come through directly through the state, some end up coming through the IU. George, you could probably talk a little bit about that as well. And some monies come through the county. So there is a very specific process. The school districts are all very aware of how to apply for grants, but we always remind them, and we're always here as a resource. Dan?
No, I think the incredible thing is that for the first time in recent memory, we have had the resources to distribute. That has not been true in Pennsylvania for a number of years. And so finally, we, to use a colloquialism, we are flush with cash. We can do this. And we've also had a commitment coming out of both legislatures, the rationale and the wisdom to do it. And so there couldn't be a better moment to be excited about the possibilities. The money is there, the distribution is coming from the state through our counties in collaboration with school boards, and the appropriate applications, I think, can be pivotal in turning some of this around. And my hope is that we're able to get this done.
So there's from the school district perspective, there's a lot of grants that are out there that many, actually all school districts and our charter schools applied for. There's also competitive grants. Some are through the state. One is the Pennsylvania Commission for Crime and Delinquency. We're waiting on that to be released, but there's a good amount of funds there that will be released to support physical upgrades. As part of it, which is really important to us in schools, they give you a list of best practices first, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions, so that we can allocate our dollars appropriately. So we're hoping to see that in the next month or so. That'll probably be in the news pretty quickly. We also have the state dollars that Senator Committa was talking about, but we also have county dollars. Many schools, and the IU wrote these grants on behalf of many of the schools. We're partnering with the University of Pennsylvania for a mental health planning and optimal development program, where our school districts can develop their own program on how to approach mental health for all students K through 12, and that was approved by the county. We also have an application that all students have access to called Rhythm. It's basically a check-in to see how students are doing, because it's not just about the threat of violence, but there's food insecurity. There's a lot of factors that impact a child's mental health. You know, how are they feeling today? Do they have access to proper medical care? We have a large population of children in Chester County that do not have access to medical care or other resources, even though we are the richest county in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of people with needs, so our county has stepped up, as well as our legislature. So we're happy to see that, and hopefully it continues, because it's not a one-year fix. In fact, it's not really something you cure. It's something you treat over a long period of time. When you think of mental health, it's a treatment. It's not a cure. And that's really difficult, because we like to put our dollars and say, here's a result, and move on. That's not what we can do here. We have to stay consistent and on the issue together.
Thank you. Several of the questions revolved around civility and being neighborly. And we see this at the national level and in our state house, and now it's showing up at our school board meetings, right? Where, how do we, or what efforts can you take to help set and be the role models of how we should interact with one another?
I'd like to start with that one. I think that this is the way, part of the way that we can help is by being examples to one another and by leading by example in a situation, a topic that is as charged and difficult as this one, the safety of our children and our own children. I think it's really, really important that you keep the temperature down and that you have these hard conversations with each other. So I think it's my job from our office's perspective to lead by example with civility and decency. I know it to be the case of those others who are on this dais with me. I think we have a real challenge in our nation right now, and I think it's possibly generational damage in terms of how long it will take us to right this, but it starts with us.
If I can add to that, I agree, and it's why in my opening comments, I talked about the idea of being conversational, but grounded in information rather than emotion, light rather than heat. I think the climate of our culture has diminished in the ability to be civil and to not demonize another for simply not agreeing with me. And I think there's a generation that's become collateral damage as a result of that, which is why sometimes it's hard to blame them for some of the things they are engaged in after having been discipled by a generation of people who have been mean-spirited, unwilling to listen, and you can fill in the blanks. And so I do think it starts with us. And I think the hope is that it becomes contagious and we see a trajectory headed in a better direction than we have in the past.
I will just add very briefly, there is an organization called the National Institute for Civil Discourse. We're all very aware of the need for civil discourse. I attended a conference with this organization earlier this year, and they have trainings for legislators, for school boards, communities, and so on. National Institute for Civil Discourse. You could check that out. I have been looking into something like that for our legislature. Again, so that we can learn the skills and be role models and convene town halls and meetings like this with a format that Chrissy set out in the beginning. Sometimes people aren't sure, well, what does civil discourse entail? And Chrissy, you were very clear about what that looks like. And we are modeling that behavior tonight, so thank you, everyone.
I believe that is all the time we have for questions.
Terrific, and thank you so much. And I know that there are a few more more questions, or at least piles of questions, a reminder to those who ask questions, we will, as a team, get back to you. Our congressional office will get back to you. If for some reason it's more appropriate that one of the other members of the panel does that, we will make sure to do that warm handoff and make that happen. For those of you who are interested in the piece of legislation that I was referring to help our police enforcement, law enforcement, help us, it's called the Invest to Protect Act. I'd also like to take an opportunity to thank the police who are here with us, protecting us tonight, with a round of applause. If it is unfortunate that that's where we are, but we are grateful for you, for your support and protection of us. I'm enormously grateful to be able to serve and protect our community down in Washington and here in our area. Please do feel free to visit us. We are in Westchester. We are near the Boston Market or the Pep Boys, whichever one reminds you of where that is as you head into Westchester. Up in Reading, we are in City Hall. Down in Washington, D.C., we're in the Longworth Building, and we welcome you to come and visit any of those places. And we can, in fact, in Washington, help you organize tours and all kinds of other exciting things for your family or for your group members. This is one in a continuing series of town halls. We rotate the place and the space and the size and the time of day and the topic. So stay tuned for the next one of these. I'm grateful if you guys would like to say some final parting words.
Just thank you, Chrissy, for bringing us all together to discuss this very important topic. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, thank you, Chrissy, so much, and everyone on the panel, because I've worked with all of you, and I'm really grateful for your support. But thank you to coming out and showing that you care about what's going on in our community. This is a wonderful event. We hope to have more of these in the future, but making sure you're having the conversations with your kids when you get home tonight will be a great opportunity for you to just say, this is what I heard about this evening, what do you think? And I think that really can broach a difficult topic in a very, easier way for you. If you have any questions, I'll be here for a little while. I'm always happy to share some suggestions that we have in law enforcement.
The joy is mine. Thank you for being here tonight, for the opportunity just to have an exchange. I look forward to further conversations. Thank you.
Thank you for your staff. Thanks for all the attendees today. We really appreciate it, especially on behalf of all of our school districts. We need your support. We really do. We can't do it alone. It's vital, because this truly is the future of our nation, is our kids and how they interact with each other. We're seeing them replicate those behaviors we see out with adults, but we can stop them. We sure can together. So thank you, Chrissy, for bringing us together, but thank you everyone for joining us today.